Hi, you're listening to The Sociology Show, a podcast about absolutely anything to do with the wonderful world of sociology. Whether you're a teacher, a lecturer, a student, or just taking a passing interest, this podcast will look at a range of issues from social class, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, crime, education, and anything else that sociology has to offer. My name is Matthew Wilkin, and each episode I will speak to someone working in the field of sociology and let them explain all about their own interests, their research, and their experiences. So, put your earphones in, turn the volume up, and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? Hello and welcome to The Sociology Show. This podcast is sponsored by Collins, high-quality student books, teacher guides, and unbeatable value revision for GCSE and A-level sociology. Now, Sociology Show listeners can get 25% off Collins Sociology resources until the end of December 2021, including a new book, How to be a Sociologist, an inspiring introduction to studying sociology at A-level and university. If you are interested in taking up the offer, then simply head to collins.co.uk/sociology show and enter Sociology Show at the checkout. Terms and conditions apply, but that's 25% off Collins Sociology resources until the end of December. The Sociology Show podcast is also brought to you in association with Tutor2U Sociology, the exam performance specialist for A-level and GCSE sociology students and teachers. And so you can visit their website, which is tutor2u.net/sociology. And there you can pick up revision guides, flashcards, revision videos, and everything else that you need for your A-level or GCSE sociology studies. And so on to the guest for this episode, and I was delighted to talk to Dr Ben Hine, who is a senior lecturer at the University of West London. He's also the co-founder of the Men and Boys Coalition. I talked to Ben about all things to do with gender and gendered issues, and in particular, some of the issues that boys and men face in the world today. And so I was really interested in this piece of research. If you're studying anything to do with gender, this is a really good listen. So without further ado, let's go over to the interview with Dr. Ben Hine. Hi, Ben. Thank you very much for joining the show.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Ben. So I always ask people to start with telling us a little bit about who you are and what you do, if you don't mind.
Yeah, of course. My name is Dr. Ben Hine. I'm a senior lecturer in psychology at the University of West London. And as part of that work, I teach and conduct research on a variety of gendered issues. My principal focus being on how gender and gender stereotypes operate within the area of domestic and sexual violence. I work with a number of organisations in that work, a number of charities. And I'm also trustee of a few charities, the Mankind Initiative, who support male victims of intimate partner violence, and also, along with being trustee, a co-founder of the Men and Boys Coalition.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you. I'm always interested. I've been asking this a lot to guests recently about why you went into that area in the first place. Is it something that you were particularly passionate about, something that you perhaps studied at a younger age? Why that kind of area, Ben?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, my general interest in gender psychology was awoken on a third year undergraduate course where I was being taught by the person who would eventually become my PhD supervisor, Professor Patrick Lehman. Was teaching about, how we can utilize psychology to understand our gendered experience. And I'd had a lot of experiences growing up around gender and, trying to kind of discover why society viewed particular things as more or less appropriate for me as a boy. And kind of just grew from there, really. I did my PhD on pro-sociality and being kind. And then through my work at the University of West London and through meeting colleagues there, and being part of a school which has psychology and things like criminology and law in it, started to figure out how we could kind of apply this to interpersonal crime and kind of make a real difference with the research, really. And I went to a couple of events as part of that work where I was meeting, survivors and speaking to people, and it really kind of highlighted the fact that I could make a difference to people's lives, hopefully through the research. So that's where I've kind of ended up where I am now.
Fantastic. Very difficult, but rewarding, I imagine.
Yeah, it is. It is difficult. I think a lot of the time you have to take a step back, and a lot of the time you view what you're looking at in quite an abstract academic way, which helps. But I am always reminded when I go to various events where I get to speak with people who are experiencing the phenomenon and survivors to really re-inject that kind of passion and empathy into the research and remind me why I'm doing it, and it is to try and make a difference. And I tend to focus on populations who are maybe what we would describe as overlooked within their particular area. So, for example, male victims of intimate partner violence and serious sexual assault, and just try and kind of highlight awareness of those individuals through the research. And one of the areas that I'm looking at the moment is around alienating behaviours and abuse involving children. And that's a personal topic for me, because I was the subject of a very long custody case between my two parents. So it's nice to kind of, well, I say nice, it's interesting and it's cathartic in a way to work in an area that has had an impact on my life and then hopefully improve the experiences of others through doing that.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing that as well, Ben. Now, you did mention as well that the key thing that I was interested in, you said about talking about male or boy issues. Working in sociology, whenever we hear the terms gender inequality, or if you were to study gender studies, the focus is very much on women. Firstly, I was really intrigued to know why you think that is, because if we are talking about gender, you would have thought it's broader, and why the focus has very much been one way and not the other.
I think that's a really interesting question, and I think often we get sucked into this kind of zero-sum game where it's kind of characterized that we can only focus on one group or the other. And one of the reasons why there has been a huge focus and the reason why feminist movements have originated is because we do exist within patriarchal systems that result in extreme inequalities. And, in many of those areas and in many circumstances, women and girls are the disadvantaged group. And it's right that we have approaches and we have research and we have solutions that focus on those groups and trying to reduce that inequality, and I wouldn't disagree with that for a second. What is often overlooked is that those same patriarchal structures have an impact and disadvantage men in particular ways, and that is something that is worthy of our attention as well, not least because those two sets of issues operate as two sides of the same coin. So, for example, if we look at sexual violence, there are many different kind of layers where gender has an impact there. It has an impact on prevalence. It has an impact on experience. It has an impact on recognition. It has an impact on services, and all of those can be delineated into different sets of arguments. So, the simplest one is what happens most to people, or who experiences this phenomenon more. But then there are other layers, which is, okay, even if those groups experience this phenomenon unequally, how do they experience that based on their gender as well? So there's lots of different ways and reasons why we might want to focus on issues that affect men and boys. Ranging from arguments of that they're worthy of investigation in their own right, all the way through to, well, we should look at this issue because it indirectly affects women and girls. And I think I subscribe to a range of those arguments that ultimately lead me to the idea that we should be looking at particular issues that clearly have a focus for men and boys. And I could give you a number of examples that are constructed around the areas of interest that we have at the Men and Boys Coalition. So, for example, suicide. So we know that about 75% of completed suicides are completed by men. Homelessness. We know that 95 or 90 to 95% of the homeless population is male. Experiences in prisons and crime etiology. We know that 95% of the prison population is male. And then things that aren't distinctly proportionate to males, but maybe they experience differently. So even though men make up, say, 5% of the rape victims within the UK each year, that still accounts to around 10 to 12,000 men, but also they might experience that victimization differently because they are men. So, my argument is that there are plenty of reasons why it's worthy to kind of look at issues that affect men and boys, and doing so will, I believe, indirectly help everybody.
Yeah, agreed. It's something that I've always found quite difficult to get my head around. Statistics show that males, of course, can be victims of abuse or violence. And quite often the argument is, from other men. And I think, well, even if it was, so what? Does that mean we care about them less because the perpetrator was a man?
Well, and even if that's the case, I think that argument shoots itself in its own foot, because you're still then highlighting that it's a male problem. It's just in a slightly different way. The other thing to say about that is that I think these arguments sometimes become so big they're almost irrefutable, whereas actually the evidence and the statistics that I've seen seriously undermine that kind of argument in and of itself. When people say, "Oh, yes, there might be male victims of domestic violence, but they're the victims of other men." Well, all of the national statistics demonstrate that that's not the case, and at least 60% of men state that their abuser is female. So I think, sometimes we go out of our way to minimize the issues that men have. And I don't necessarily think that's very productive, either for the men themselves or for women and girls who, often would indirectly benefit from the kind of scrutiny in those areas. So, I certainly come from a perspective that we live in a society that has certain systems that disadvantage us all just in different ways, and we need to be tackling that from all different angles in order to produce meaningful change, because otherwise you're only ever going to be looking at kind of one half of the equation, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I just wondered if we could dig down a little bit deeper into that, Ben, as to why you think that happens. I mean, for example, there is an International Men's Day, and often when International Men's Day comes out, I think it's in November, there's quite often some controversy or backlash to that. The argument, what have men got to worry about, sort of thing. And when you reel off some of the things that you've just mentioned, men are likely to die younger. They're more likely to have education. They're more likely to take their own life. How can those issues be dismissed? I just don't understand why, or how those can be swept under the carpet as sort of insignificant, because they're quite clearly not.
In my opinion, it's unequivocal that men as a group have issues, that we need to focus on. I think one of the issues I see in this area is how we reason about privilege. So it's a word gets bandied around a lot, and this is what kind of fuels these comments towards, say, International Men's Day. And I see a lot of comments saying, well, every day is International Men's Day. And that's kind of a recognition of the fact that men as a group and, in many ways do sit at one end of the spectrum of privilege. So if you look at, there are lots of different intersecting kind of systems that we can operate within in terms of how privileged we are. We have a system of race that we operate within, where white people tend to sit in a position of privilege and other groups do not. We have a system of gender that we sit within, where men are generally afforded more privilege within that system than women. And we have things like class, we have socioeconomic status. So all these different things intersect to produce a kind of broader system that places us in a particular position of privilege. People might look at me and they might look at me as a white middle-class male and think, he's pretty privileged. Now, the problem with that is that when we talk about gender, we tend to position men in a position of what I call universal privilege. Because we tend to be more privileged, people believe that privilege applies everywhere and uniformly across everything. So as a man, it basically suggests that I have no problems or issues. Same with women, for example. It kind of propagates this idea that because they exist at the other end of that system, that they are universally, unprivileged and do not have access to the privileges that men do. Now, in many circumstances, that inequality is evident and something that we should address. However, it's not universal. And we see that through those statistics that you were just stating then, because actually this system that we operate in, it teaches us particular values that actually take away privilege in certain situations. So as boys are socialized as they grow up, boys are socialized fundamentally away from emotion. Now, that doesn't put them in a position of privilege. That disadvantages them in terms of moving through life and being aware of their emotions and being able to regulate, etc. So actually what that means and what that translates to is not a position of privilege when it comes to things like mental health, because men aren't acknowledged to have mental health issues and to require help. So that's not a position of privilege by any stretch of the imagination. If we look at parenting roles, there's a lot of stereotypes and beliefs and role constructions around parenting that actually don't really place fathers in a position of privilege at all. So that when you then extrapolate that to an abusive context, for example, men are hugely disadvantaged in that sense, because if a man wants to leave an abusive setting, there is absolutely no facility within this country at present for them to remove the children with them from that situation. Whereas we wouldn't even question that if it was the woman in that situation. Of course, she should be able to take their kids. So I think it all stems from this idea that men are problems, that they don't have problems. And in a lot of senses, and I'm not making excuses on behalf of men worldwide here, there are many, many scenarios, and we see atrocities perpetrated by men every single day that deserve examination, deserve our inquiry, and deserve our condemnation. But that doesn't necessarily then mean that we get to blanketly say men don't have issues. And there's a few colleagues of mine who have written on this, and the so-called gamma bias and this kind of empathy gap between men and women. And one of the interesting quotes that often accompanies that argument is a famous Hillary Clinton quote, where she states that the primary victims of war are the women and girls left behind. And I think that just exemplifies it perfectly, because surely the primary victims of war are the men that are killed. Again, not saying that women aren't killed in battle, but obviously proportionately men are much higher likelihood. So I think there's a lot of things going on there. And again, I just restate my argument. This isn't me saying we need to stop focusing on female issues and start focusing on male issues, etc. It's me saying I think it would serve everybody if we recognize that each of those groups has their own woes, and that we need to look at those in order to kind of move us forward as a society, because otherwise you're leaving one half behind.
The Sociology Show podcast relies on the kind contributions of sponsorship and donations. If you enjoy the show, then you can help with the hosting costs by donating as little as £5 on the GoFundMe page. Simply visit uk.gofundme.com and search for the Sociology Show. If you can donate, then you will be sent a Sociology Show pen as a small thank you for your continued support of the show.
It seems that a lot of the arguments have come very binary, a them and us, a men versus women. And if you're looking at gender, you can only look at women because they are the oppressed and many of the oppressors. And like you said, that there must be many scenarios that you're seeing, Ben, where those issues for males are just kind of being ignored, swept under the carpet, or just forgotten about completely.
Yeah, I mean, the research areas that I work in with regards to domestic violence, I mean, it's very tough to kind of break through these narratives and say, there are situations where men are being abused, and it's not, for example, because they, have done something that somehow makes them responsible for it, and it's not the woman acting in self-defense. So there are always arguments that are pushed forward against that recognition. And again, this isn't me saying that women don't use violence ever in self-defense. Of course, I wouldn't say that. It's about recognizing that, we need to break out of this idea of men as completely invulnerable. And again, this is my argument for saying that actually these patriarchal systems that we exist within, and all of these kind of traditional structures of gender, they hold everybody back. Yes, the repercussions for women are often much, much greater. And again, I wouldn't serve to deny that. But I don't think that the solutions lie in ignoring the problem. And one of the examples that I used just on a call earlier today, actually, was saying, a lot of these issues take root in how we socialize young boys and girls. And for boys, it's something that we need to examine, because the way that we socialize boys in terms of expressing their emotions, I believe, is the kind of antecedent factor for so many of the issues that the world sees today. Now, if we started recognizing that this is a problem, and if we started recognizing that boys and men have problems and are worthy of that attention and are worthy of that inquiry and are worthy of us spending time on developing them, we would actually see many, many, many positive repercussions, not just for men and boys, but for women and girls and everybody else as well. You know, for LGBT groups and ethnic minority groups, and all of these systems operate together, and there is no infallible person. There is no person that exists in a complete epitome of privilege within any system. And we need to kind of start to break down this idea that a group isn't worthy of our attention because more generally they occupy a position of power within a structure. I think that that's kind of quite limited thinking.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense to me. I mean, if we come from a starting point that boys and men are invulnerable to pain or suffering or inequality, that's actually going to force them to try and be more stoic, to not open up as much, to cause frustration and possibly anger and so on anyway, isn't it? So it's completely counterproductive, actually.
Well, and it's a very difficult one to navigate. And again, you know, I want to recognize really strongly that I had a debate recently with someone on Twitter, which I would stress to anybody listening is never the place really to have a debate. It's never productive. But it was about whether men can occupy positions of allyship in terms of feminism.
Yes.
And I thought it was really interesting because the person I was having a debate with was very categorically saying, no, you know, men are not part of the feminist movement. They have no place. It's for women, by women. And you know, many people listening to this podcast might say, well, again, this is just a man trying to center men instead of, you know, allowing a woman to talk about women's issues, etc. I think, you know, sometimes I believe that the way we approach the arguments can be too binary, too zero-sum game, too it's us and them, in a way that actually disenfranchises men from really important conversations. And I was speaking about this with someone recently in terms of the kind of rise of incels. And I believe that some of the root cause of that is from not bringing together everybody to have these kind of group conversations about what's kind of going wrong. I think actually, you know, sometimes an inadvertent and an unintended consequence of centering the debate and the you know, narrative around women and girls issues, which again, I'm not saying is wrong, but I'm saying one of the unintended consequences, I think, is the disenfranchisement of men from that conversation, which kind of leads them to be bitter and to regress even further into those kind of traditional archetypes of masculinity, which can be really, really damaging. So I think, you know, we need to make space for everybody within the conversation and make sure that we're kind of approaching these issues in the way that they touch upon us all and kind of affect us all negatively.
Because on that point, Ben, I've asked this to a few people working within gender. Is there an argument for sort of renaming the movement, that it's a gender equality movement? Because I think for many people, they do associate the word feminism with women's issues or the women's movement. You know, I'm not sure if we're talking about the same person, but a book's recently come out called Feminism for Women, which says it should be centered on women and women only. So is there an argument that we could shift the politics to be talking about a gender equality movement, which is more encompassing?
I've thought about this quite a lot. I don't think so. I think what we need to do as men is generate an equivalent movement and think about it but in a collaborative way. Because I think the accusation, and I think it would be a founded one, is that if we were campaigning and saying we need to get rid of feminism and make it about gender equality more broadly, it would be decentering women's issues, which are very worthy of our attention. And, you know, I think that's where you then cross the boundary into some, quite horrible individuals that I've come across in the past that are looking to do that, and they do so for very, negative reasons and hatred of women, etc. And I think it would be valid for women to say, hold on a second, we've spent decades, hundreds of years fighting for this movement and to reposition ourselves within these structures, and then you're just coming along and saying we should rename it. I don't think that's appropriate. What I think we need to do is come up with a framework and a kind of philosophical position where we're able to take the same kind of journey in the deconstruction of masculinity and male gender roles as well, and to think about what that means for us. And I say us, and I'm treating men as a hugely kind of homogenous group, but just for the purposes of this argument, we need to, as the other group, take on that responsibility, because at the moment nothing seems to be really working that well. Applying feminist theory to male issues isn't really working tremendously well, and I would never argue for kind of neutralizing the movement. So I think what we need is a movement that's constructed in the right vein for the right reasons and in a collaborative manner with feminism, to say, okay, look, we're acknowledging that men are problems in many contexts, and also men have problems in many contexts. So let's figure out why that is. And for me, as someone who kind of teaches gender development, as well as looks at the application of gender in practice and in the real world, there are huge links there that we haven't really pieced together. We haven't really stopped and thought to ourselves, okay, every time a boy falls over, we scream at them not to cry and to keep it together. I wonder whether that's why they can't process any kind of dramatic life changes, and why they have emotional dysregulation later on in life. I don't think we're drawing enough of those links, but I don't think neutralizing feminism is the way to go.
Yeah, it's really difficult, isn't it? Because I think you kind of just alluded to this in what you were just saying. But if you classify yourself as a men's rights activist, for example, that often comes across wrong and can be quite misogynistic. And in fact, if you say you're a supporter of male rights, you can be criticised for being misogynistic. So it's really difficult. How do you say you are concerned and worry about men's issues without portraying misogyny or anti-feminism?
And the issue exists on both sides of the spectrum. Within any movement, you're going to have people who range in terms of their fanaticism, and I am similarly apprehensive about calling myself a men's rights activist, because there are plenty of unsavory characters, but I'm sure there are people within the feminist movement who feel the same. I think for me as a researcher, I'm always focused on the issue at hand and how to utilize the methods at our disposal to exploring it and to illuminating the issues around it. So I've learned over the years to steer clear of labels and focus on the problem at hand, because I've had the same issues with classing myself as a feminist as I have as an MRA. So I think I'm more focused on the problem rather than how I label myself in that journey, I think.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you. I just wanted to ask you a little bit more about your work for, you said, Mankind and also Men and Boys Coalition. Did you want to say a little bit more about what that involves and what that's about for us?
Yeah, so as part of my research, I've worked with the Mankind Initiative on a number of occasions and now work as a trustee for them. And they are a call line in the UK, one of the only ones dedicated to male victims, and one of the only ones constructed in a way that I would classify as gender inclusive. So in a way that kind of recognises, that men can be victims of domestic violence and understands the needs that are associated with that. And we've produced some really kind of interesting and meaningful work as a result of that, looking at what the experiences of the call handlers are and what they see as the issue, but also looking at the data that Mankind have amassed together, and what the needs of callers are, etc. So it's mainly about working with them to produce evidence, so that can feed into an evidence body to help support some of the, what you might call more colloquial, accounts from call handlers. But also, reviewing training and raising awareness and contributing with them to events. We speak to bodies like the Home Office and the Crown Prosecution Service about their guidance. We've had input into the VOG strategies, the violence against women and girls strategies, and the male statements within that strategy, and in fact lobbying for the violence against men and boys strategy, which is yet to come to fruition, but we will keep battling away. And the Men and Boys Coalition was more about trying to bring together this kind of big consortium of academics and journalists and politicians and activists and organizations to recognize that men and boys do have issues in, I think we have 4 or 5 core areas, including men's health and mental health, hidden or vulnerable populations like the homeless and victims of sexual and domestic violence, fatherhood, education, and kind of thinking about how we can raise awareness principally, but also utilizing research and professional practice together in knowledge exchange to generate best practice for organizations. And it's about eroding this more general idea that men don't have things wrong and that we shouldn't care, because in all those different areas I've spoken to people and the professionals that support them, that recognize that there are huge issues, and we need to think about and tackle this indifference principally more than anything else, because some of the areas that we've touched upon are hugely impactful, like homelessness, crime, suicide. These are all huge questions that if you flipped the numbers and it was a quote unquote female issue, there would be funding, there would be parliamentary groups, there would be committees, there would be, there are a couple of salient examples. So the education crisis. So we have girls outperforming and out-achieving boys at every single level of education. We have a huge number going to university above boys, so a huge number of applicants who are females going to university over men. And there's not really a word of it in the news. So the most recent A-level results day, girls vastly outperform boys. And, one of the headlines was, "Is it time to admit girls are cleverer than boys?" Now, if that was reversed and boys were outperforming girls, there would be outrage, there would be coverage, there would be questions, etc. And it's the same for subject areas. So we have huge initiatives to get girls into STEM, science, technology, engineering, and maths, because they are still male-dominated. If you look at the other end of that table, there are plenty of subjects around performance art, languages, and English literature and language that are wildly undersubscribed by boys. But we don't have any coverage, any initiatives, anything to try and improve that situation. So that's education. If you look at the prison population, there are always articles, little video pieces on the news about what can we do to improve the female prison population. Now, a worthy endeavour, I'm not arguing against that, but women make up between 3 and 5% of the prison population in the UK. There's no desire, there's no interest in understanding men's experiences and why there are so many of them in prison above and beyond women. And it's just excused by saying, well, men are just like that way, aren't they? They're just violent. Well, even if that's the case, shouldn't we ask why? Shouldn't we try and understand why that is and try and, think about why there's this huge disproportionality? Same with suicide. If it was 75% suicides completed by women, there would be more interest. And the interest that there is in suicide is focused on women. Same with homelessness. So we really need to kind of break out of this position where we think that men are invulnerable and that they don't have problems, because doing that would inevitably serve the whole of society in a very meaningful way.
Absolutely, Ben. I can't really echo that anymore. I absolutely agree with every word you've said there. That the overall aim is to benefit everyone. It's not just trying to help men, and not trying to help men at the expense of women either. It is there,
Exactly.
to help everyone. Yeah.
It's not as it's not a zero-sum game, and that's very much where the conversation always goes. And myself and the organisations that I work with are always very clear to say, if we're lobbying for more funding, for example, for male services, that we would never do so suggesting that should be at the expense of female services. It should be in addition to, because we're simply recognising that on top of well-recognised issues, there are these other issues that deserve funding as well. And often the anger gets directed towards each other, whereas it should be directed, for example, to governments and bodies that are in charge of this funding to say, okay, you need to increase the funding to accommodate this new need. And I think sometimes, you just get stuck in these reductive arguments where people say, oh, I've got it worse. Is that really that productive? Or should we be figuring out, okay, how do we better this situation for everybody involved in order to advance ourselves as a society at large? And within that, you can readily recognize that different groups have a different proportion of suffering and a different proportion of issue. And within that, for example, you can readily acknowledge and accept that the numbers do suggest, for example, that 95% of rape victims in the UK are women. Okay, gendered issue, no arguments there. However, for those 10 to 12,000 men who are raped every year, we need to understand what they're going through and we need to support them. Same with any issue. We can tackle it at many different layers without getting into this battle that in the end leads to no improvement for anyone.
Well said, Ben. Thank you so much for your time and input today, Ben. I always ask people if they want to give out any details. Where can people find out more about your work or follow you on Twitter, or perhaps more about some of the groups that you've talked about?
Yeah, so the easiest place is to probably follow me on Twitter, because I tend to kind of retweet a lot of the organisations that I work with, and people can follow there. So my handle is Dr Ben Hine. You can also just Google me, and my university page at University of West London will come up, and there's kind of links to publications and other things that I'm kind of doing, and all the research and things like that. But if people want to, my direct messages are open on Twitter, so if people want to get in contact on Twitter and discuss, and I'm the main thing is I'm always open to kind of talking about these things, and developing my thinking on different topics, and even if people disagree, just trying to understand, okay, why are they disagreeing, and where might they be coming from on that particular issue. And like I said, I think it's all too easy sometimes to jump to conclusions and think, oh, this person's talking about this and wants to kind of minimize this. And I'm just focused on the issues, and I've done plenty of work on female issues as well. A lot of my work with the police is on female victims of rape and serious sexual assault. So, I'm interested in finding out where problems lie and figuring out what we can do about them.
Well, thank you so much for your time again today, Ben. I really, really do appreciate it.
No problem. Thank you so much for having me.
The Sociology Show podcast relies on the kind contributions of sponsorship and donations. If you enjoy the show, then you can help with the hosting costs by donating as little as £5 on the GoFundMe page. Simply visit uk.gofundme.com and search for The Sociology Show. If you can donate, then you will be sent a Sociology Show pen as a small thank you for your continued support of the show.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. If you would like to contact the show or be interviewed, then please email the sociologyshowpodcast@gmail.com.